All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Academic Success Center. This is our workshop on test taking, and we're so glad to have you here. We're going to start off with Mr. Dylan Faullin. He's got a shortish presentation, and then we're going to have Mr. Mark Whiteley speak. And then we've got some students. We've got, and Linda, I'm going to mess up your name, Linda Almendarez from the International Club, and then a couple of the ASC's tutors that are going to give some input on how to be successful at test taking. So with that, we'll go ahead and let Mr. Faullin go. And you can either put that around you or hold it or whatever makes you comfortable. Or nothing.
Nothing will, I don't think. All right. Okay, so I was asked to speak on, preparing for a test, and as a math teacher, I didn't know if I was specifically supposed to address math tests, but some of the ideas I have here would just be helpful for any test in general. I like to listen to podcasts, especially like when I'm grading, and one podcast I really like, I don't know if anybody's listened to it, is Freakonomics. And these guys wrote a book like back in the 90s on, it's on economics, but they kind of study different aspects of people's behavior and trying to understand why people behave the way that they do. And this particular podcast, it wasn't talking about test taking, but I feel like it applies to my students when they're preparing for a test. So there is this concept that they talked about on this podcast called the planning fallacy. So the planning fallacy, I'm going to skip the names there, is a phenomenon in which predictions about how much time will be needed to complete a future task display an optimism bias, and you underestimate the time needed. So, for example, whenever there's like a construction project, they'll estimate, well, this will take us 2 years to build this bridge or whatever, but it ends up taking 4 years, and it goes over budget by like $1 million or whatever. That's the planning fallacy. So we tend to underestimate the complications that we're going to encounter in dealing with these big projects. So the planning fallacy, keep that in mind. There's also, it mentions it in the previous screen, optimism bias is a cognitive bias that causes a person to believe that they are at a lesser risk of experiencing a negative event compared to others. So for example, I was trying to think of some good examples of this, but maybe like for gambling, for example, the odds are really stacked against you, but we feel like we're going to be able to beat those odds, right? So that we have sort of an optimism bias thinking that we'll have a better outcome than other people. Yes, Mark? Texting and driving. Oh, yeah, I can do this. I'm skilled enough and so I won't get into a car wreck. Yeah, right. Yeah, other people are going to have problems, but I can handle this, right? Yeah, thank you. That's a good example. Yeah. So optimism bias. And the other thing I want to talk about was loss aversion. So in cognitive psychology and decision theory, loss aversion refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. So we process it differently, losing $5 versus gaining $5, right? We feel worse about losing $5 than we do feeling good about finding $5, right? We feel a little good about finding $5, but we feel really bad if we lost $5. So loss aversion. So the way I feel like this applies to my students when they're preparing for a test is the following way. It will take more time to prepare for an exam than you think, right? So again, it's a project that you're getting ready for, right? Taking an exam, it's an undertaking. And you will underestimate the amount of time it's going to take for you to get ready for that test. So keep that in mind when you're budgeting your time. Like, I need to get ready for this exam. How am I, when do I need to get started? How long is it going to take me until I'm really ready for this test? You need to start earlier than you think, right? So that's how I think the planning fallacy applies to my students when they're trying to get ready for an exam. The optimism. I think I put the wrong thing there. It shouldn't be fallacy, right? Optimism bias, sorry about that typo. You are never as prepared as you think you are. And, you think, well, I can study like this much and I should get a pretty good outcome based on that. But again, that could be the optimism bias in play because you think, this negative event's I can't fail a test, right? I'm not going to fail this. So, keep that in mind. So you want to over prepare, spend more time than you think you need to make sure you're ready for the test. And I think I felt this way. Like, don't be afraid to put in a lot of quality time and effort to prepare for an exam. I think this, is connected to loss aversion because we feel like if we're sinking a lot of time into preparing for this test and we still end up doing poorly, we feel like, well, we just lost all of that time and it didn't have any payoff or whatever. And I can remember as a student feeling that way, because, and sometimes you do reach this point. It's like, well, where I'm at right now, maybe I'll make a 90 on the test. And if I study for another 5 hours, I might be able to bring it up to like a 93. So is it worth that 5 hours to get that extra 3 points, right? So you don't want to like sink that time in if the payoff isn't going to be good enough, right? But don't be afraid to sink in quality time and effort into preparing for a test. It does pay off. It may, maybe you don't feel like it does when you see your score or whatever, but it helps you in the long run. So put in that extra time. Don't be afraid to do that. So tips for being ready for a math test. I know in my class, for example, working on the homework in a timely manner. So I have my homework due when the exam comes up, and a lot of students will put off the homework until the exam comes up. They should be working on the homework as we're covering the material in class. So whatever information you're digesting in class, you need to reinforce it within a certain time frame, or you're going to lose any concepts that you were starting to understand while you were in class. So if you wait, you hear something in class and then you wait a week to start working on it, you're basically starting from square one because you're going to forget everything that you picked up the week before. So work on the homework in a timely manner. Work on the homework with other students, working together, helping each other out. That can help cement the ideas in your mind. I don't have this problem so much anymore, but I remember when I first started teaching, I have a lot of students that they wouldn't really try the problem. They just kind of look at it and say, I don't know what to do, and ask me to show them how to do it, which I can do all day long. And the analogy I gave for that is like if you want to learn how to ride a bike, you can't learn how to ride a bike by watching somebody else ride a bike over and over and over, right? You have to try to ride the bike first. So works the same way with math. Try the problems yourself first, and then if you get stuck or whatever, then you can ask for help. But the act of trying, even if you're not successful, just trying is part of the learning process and will help you learn the material. Take turns explaining how to do the problems to each other. So when you teach somebody else, it helps you understand the concept better. And it also helps you realize where you're having trouble, right? Because if you're trying to explain to somebody else and you don't really understand it that well, you're going to have trouble explaining to somebody else, and you might realize, I don't understand this as well as I thought I did. Understanding is better than memorizing. So I'll have students that try to memorize the process to a problem. And when you get on the test, our memories aren't perfect, and you don't quite remember exactly how to do it. But if you understand the concepts and understand the way the problem works, that you don't really lose that when you go to take the test, right? Your memory will fail you, but your understanding won't. So I always encourage students to try to really understand the material. Don't just try to memorize, how do I get this answer, but understand, why am I taking this step? Why am I taking this step? And if you understand it, that's going to be there for you when you take the test. Start studying early. At least for my math test, I'd say at least a week in advance would be a good time to get started. And make sure you know how to do the problems without help, right? So I have students that will study for the test, but they're constantly looking at the help that's available online or asking somebody else to help them through the problem. But you won't have those resources when you're actually taking the test. So you want to make sure you can do the problem. Keep trying over and over and over until you can do it without looking at your notes or getting help from anybody else. And I thought, okay, so those were some good tips, but I thought maybe I need to be a little more basic than that. So I put this at the very end. Know when your exam is scheduled, right? So I swear sometimes I have students, they come into the class and it's like they didn't have a pencil and they didn't know there was an exam. And they still take it. They're like, okay, well, I guess there's an exam, so I'm going to take the exam. But it seemed like they didn't have any idea. And that happens pretty frequently. Come prepared with a pencil, with a calculator if that's relevant to the test you're taking. And if there is a practice exam, use it. When I first started providing practice exams, the students were very grateful for that, and they really focused on it, and they took advantage of it. And I feel like over the years, I find my students aren't really using it as much as they should. So if there's some kind of practice material available, make sure you take advantage of that and go through that and ask your teacher if, after you do it, if you had any problems on any parts of it, then you can go talk to your teacher about that. But you have something to show that you've tried it and gives your teacher an idea. Because when I'm trying to answer students' questions, it helps me to know what where are they coming from? What is their thought process on the problem? And then I can help them fill in the gaps. But if you just say, I don't know what I'm doing, you just give me a blank piece of paper and say, explain this to me, it's hard for me to tailor my response to where you're actually having trouble with the content. So having tried the problems first, that definitely helps your teacher explain things to you a little bit better, tailor their explanations to you. So that's all I have. So I hope that was adequate. And thank you for letting me go first. So.
Do you have any questions?
Oh, yes. Yeah, don't know that I'll have answers, but...
Yeah. Okay, we'll pause it.